Arpa Kotishwaran. I'm a reader in Law and Social Justice at the Dixon Poon School of Law here at King's College London, and I'm co-editor with other academics of the Open Democracy blog Beyond Trafficking and Slavery. At BTS, we want to challenge the predominant paradigm within which trafficking and modern slavery is discussed. We are quite skeptical about technocratic policy responses to what is a fundamental problem of socioeconomic inequality. But we are also interested in going beyond critique to ask what's next. So how do we translate our critical voice into one that also engages with law and policymakers as well as other stakeholders in a meaningful way? With that in mind, we are here today to discuss the Modern Slavery Act of 2015, which was passed by the British Parliament in March 2015 with a view to eradicating modern slavery in the UK. Joining me today to discuss the act is Cindy Berman, who is Head of Knowledge and Learning at the Ethical Trading Initiative. Cindy, welcome to King's.
Thank you.
So you've worked in this field of trafficking for many years now in varied capacities. And just before you joined ETI recently, you were at the Department for International Development. So please tell us a little bit about your experience in this field.
Yes, thank you. I started about, having worked on labour and social exclusion and gender issues and human rights issues for many years, I started focusing on human trafficking and modern slavery about 8 years ago when I was in DFID working in the South Asia department as a senior social development advisor, developing a program around forced labour. It started as a project that I think ministers were quite attracted by, the idea of doing something on trafficking, and I had the difficult task of persuading them that we should be focusing on labour trafficking and forced labour rather than on sex trafficking. It wasn't very popular at the time, and what I sought to do was to call on a whole set of stakeholders and expertise to think about what had been achieved in this field, where there were promising examples of practice, what the theory of change was for how you address some of these systemic issues of exploitation, poverty, vulnerability, and so on. So we developed the program Work in Freedom, which I'm very proud to have been involved in the design or have led the design of, and with a very strong focus on evidence-driven approaches, stakeholder engagement and partnerships at the very core of that theory of change, recognizing that it's very difficult for one actor or one initiative to achieve change, real change, in a context in which the issue is as complex and involves many different layers, many different actors, and many different roots of the problem. And so I think what we started off with was testing the ground with a kind of brainstorming process and some seed funding, just to see what would people do if they had the opportunity to do things differently to what they had done. And that yielded some interesting findings, and working with academics, including with yourself, Prabha, we came up with a design of a program that had a very strong evidence dimension with the London School of Hygiene Tropical Medicine, and a partnership with the ILO and its stakeholders to address the issue of preventing forced labour, trafficking of women and girls in South Asia in the domestic work and garment sectors. And so then I joined ETI about 18 months ago, kind of building on that experience. And it was a time that many conversations were being had in the public domain about modern slavery, what it was, what we thought about it, etc. And I think I walked in at the right time, in the right place to lead ETI's work on modern slavery. I think the need for some degree of understanding of where the perspectives of companies were, a lot of our commercial corporate members, our trade union members and NGOs. ETI, as people may know, is a multi-stakeholder initiative that was founded about 17 years ago. One of the first initiatives that sort of preceded the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, that was really focusing on business responsibilities to respect workers' rights and workers' rights to access to grievance and remedy, and civil society's role in ensuring that companies were held to account. And so in this tripartite partnership, you have this creative tension of companies that commit themselves to addressing these issues, as well as trade unions and stakeholders, civil society stakeholders that engage in that debate. So what we did, so that's really my background, and so I came into ETI and was thrust into the whole process of engagement around the Modern Slavery Bill and Act.
That's great, Cindy. So what was the thinking within ETI at that point on the question of modern slavery?
Well, forced labour and child labour is one of the key elements of the ETI base code, because when companies sign up to the ETI, they sign up to what we call the base code, which is based on ILO conventions, some of the core ILO labour conventions. There are 9 of them: forced labour, child labour, non-discrimination, payment of wages, agreed working hours, health and safety, and so on, are all part of that mix. So it's been on the table, but I think that it was assumed that that was something that most companies that signed up didn't really need to think about or worry about too much, because the debates were much more around whether you're paying living wages and how many hours and health and safety issues and so on. And I mean, now when we think about it, I think the exposés in the media, the campaigns by civil society organizations have shifted that hugely. And I think the debates around the bill and the Modern Slavery Act certainly got the attention going. I think that Rana Plaza was a game changer for many companies, although we're not talking overtly about a trafficking situation, but we're looking at issues of choice for workers to leave work in an environment that they felt was unsafe, desperate to earn wages almost at any cost, extreme vulnerability of those workers. And I think it kind of got many of our members and the business community writ large, especially in the retail sector, to take note. And since then, there have been endless exposures. The Thai shrimp and fishing industry, I don't need to remind you of them, but I think it certainly has focused attention, and people have been wanting to get solutions and get help with some of those things. And ETI is an obvious place to come to because it takes as our basic premise that these things are not always clear cut. Sometimes exploitation is absolutely clear cut, and there are very clear roles and responsibilities that have not been upheld. But sometimes one's leverage over a supply chain and influence and knowledge and visibility of labour conditions in supply chains is more complex and more difficult. And so I think companies come to the ETI space not only to have a more honest and safe space to talk with other companies that face similar problems and to collaborate with each other in a pre-competitive space, but also because they recognize that trade unions and NGOs have to be part of the determining the solutions as well, and have to be in partnership in addressing some of these crises. So ETI was also well placed to hold those kinds of conversations.
Mm-hmm. So how did ETI's role as, a tripartite organization move towards one of advocacy? What kinds of political opportunities did ETI see in the processes leading up to the adoption of the Modern Slavery Act?
Yes. Well, firstly, as we know, the first draft of the bill had nothing about supply chains and almost nothing about labour exploitation. So that was kind of a no-brainer, gobsmacking scenario in which we had a number of meetings with the Home Office and sort of highlighted the weight of importance that they needed to give to labour issues. And they just weren't getting it. They were saying, well, companies need to be held to account, and we think all of you guys, being the ETI and some of the other companies around the table, you need to just show what good practice looks like. And we were certainly around that table saying, actually, there is no good practice, really. We're all struggling with this issue, and while companies have signed up to being members of the ETI because they want to be more responsible or because they are trying to manage their reputations, good practice needs to be, can only happen when there is a level playing field and when there is decent government regulation and legislation that underpins their own practice. Otherwise, they are competing in an unfair market in which unscrupulous actors get away with the same things that those companies that are trying to act more responsibly will be undercut by them. So we started with a series of meetings and events to raise awareness amongst our own corporate members and bringing different perspectives to the table. We had a number of meetings with the Home Office, and they were, to be honest, they convened a range of meetings with industry. They wanted to hear from industry, and their assumption was that that industry did not want to be burdened with regulation, and that simply voluntary standards and civil society challenge of companies would be more than enough, and the government should be, not interfering in that process. And they slowly started to get the message that actually industry really wanted regulation, responsible industry wanted regulation. And I think the most significant game changer was when we put together a letter, and I have to say it took a huge amount of effort and persuasion and cajoling and all my influencing skills to get companies to agree to put their logos on that letter. And the letter went to David Cameron, and it was overwhelming support for legislation and the Transparency in Supply Chains clause. At that point, we really wanted to get something in the bill. Was it as much as we wanted? Absolutely not. But it's certainly, came back from that summer after we sent in a letter and saw the announcement suddenly by the Home Office that there would be a Transparency in Supply Chains clause. So I think that really did shift the needle, despite the fact that MPs and NGOs had been haranguing and engaging for a long time. They really needed to get that message from industry. And so that letter was signed not only by industry members, but also, and we worked very closely with the British Retail Consortium, compromising where necessary on some language. But that carried a lot of weight too, the fact that they were it was an industry body and had obviously the signatures of our trade union and NGO members as well. And from then we engaged with not only government officials and ministers, but indeed sent letters, several policy statements and position messages around the consultation on the Transparency in Supply Chains clause, what we wanted to see there, as well as directly engaging with MPs and the Lords on these issues. And that certainly seemed to make a difference in what eventually happened. Mm-hmm. And we then continued till recently in the process of the statutory guidance being drafted. Again, at times kind of having to play hardball and saying we won't be associated with this guidance unless it has the following things in it. Not that we are signatories to the guidance, but I can say that we've influenced it heavily. It's a lot better than what it would have been.
Mm-hmm. So I wondered whether you could walk us through Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act and the requirement for commercial organizations to provide slavery and human trafficking statements. I mean, how does this compare with what you proposed, and what do you see as the strengths and the drawbacks of this particular form of disclosure in the Act?
Yep. Well, I think it's an entry point. It's certainly not it. And we know that there are some very serious legal loopholes which some companies will be more than willing to exploit. And they have a number of lawyers advising them on what they needn't disclose and what they can get away with. However, it has got a different kind of conversation going within companies. There is absolutely no doubt, because it's in law, and because companies signed off at board level have to produce a statement. And that, for us, is the most significant thing, is that it's driving a different conversation. That has to be, the statement has to be underpinned by a reflection on what companies are actually doing, not what they're saying, it's what they're doing. And they will be held to account for what they are doing and say they're doing. And that involves thinking through their due diligence in a very different way, thinking through remediation and grievance mechanisms in a different way, thinking through their governance and business practices in a different way, and realizing that the problem is not simply out there in, the nether regions of India somewhere, but actually it's right on their doorstep in the form of their cleaning contracts and their catering and their a whole range of other services. So I think what we're very pleased about, at least, is that goods and services are included, that it includes own operations as well as supply chains. Those are two big differences from the California Act. And we really pushed very hard that the threshold should be as low as possible. And I have to say we were amazed that that the threshold was set at 36 million, which we encouraged, which our members encouraged. And we were way ahead. In fact, a lot of the companies that were in agreement with us were way ahead of some of even the NGOs like Walk Free that were talking about 1 billion or 1 million, or 1 billion as the threshold. So that was a big, it's an important starting point. I think there's a big conversation underway, and I think a valuable conversation about transparency and what you reveal about what you find in your supply chain and in your own operations. And companies are saying, well, how honest should we be? Are we setting ourselves up for attack and exposés by NGOs and the media if we say, yes, we found slavery in our supply chain? Or do we be open and honest, and who's going to reward us for doing that? And how sophisticated, if you like, is the public understanding of how complicated this stuff is? And so I think, we are also driving a big discussion and debate amongst our trade union and NGO colleagues, as well as pushing our companies to be as open and transparent as they can be, and as serious as they need to be about tackling this issue. But with the understanding that when they are scrutinized, they should be rewarded for being more honest and not exposed and campaigned against for having found slavery. And I think that's where the piece of research we've just undertaken with the Ashridge Holt Business School was really important, because we surveyed companies, some of the bigger ones, or more well-known brands and retailers, including supermarkets and apparel brands and so on, and general merchandise. And they found that 71% of people said they thought there was a very high likelihood that slavery exists at some point in their supply chain. And that finding, I think, enables a different conversation to be had, which is, look, let's assume it's there and let's figure out what we're going to do about it, rather than let's hope nobody's going to find out and let's do our damnedest to kind of cover our backs. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, clearly it sounds like some of your members are quite proactive in coming to that realization that the default is that there is, in fact, forced labor in supply chains rather than not. But clearly there's a whole range of other businesses who are probably not there yet in terms of the realization of the gravity of these issues. So in terms of regulatory models, there are clearly many examples around the world, and many were proposed during the debates leading up to the Act, including simply incorporating reporting requirements under the Companies Act, or having disclosure requirements as in the US, and a supply chain transparency clause. But there were others who also recommended that there should be criminal liability for CEOs of of corporations, and this is clearly quite a controversial proposal. And then, of course, there are other kinds of mechanisms, such as in Brazil, where the reputational costs of companies engaging in slave labor are hauled up.
Mm.
So there was clearly a range of models for ETI to pick from. And how did you make a decision about which of these would promote the goals of the organization the best?
I think it wasn't a decision by ETI about which route to take. I think we were being politically expedient about where we were likely to get some traction as opposed to not. So there were issues around the Bribery Act model, and certainly the Brazilian model is always held up, and I think we would absolutely agree that that the Brazil model works as effectively as it does, because not just because there's a dirty list, but because there is a whole army of labour inspectors, that the government is deeply committed, that there is strong legislation, that there are excellent investigative journalists, civil society NGOs. It's sort of a perfect mix of actors, stakeholders, and so that context is ripe for that dirty list to take root. So I don't think we chose something and said that was the best we could come up with. I think it was that TISC was the only thing that was on the table, and we decided to try and make it better than it was. Mm-hmm. I think that corporate and corporate liability cases will certainly drive a very different conversation, and I think there's an important role for that. We also know that very good media exposés and journalists that actually know what they're doing definitely drives action. There is no doubt that companies are unlikely to act as effectively as we would like them to act unless they are driven by some scandal. Sad, but it is true. I have to say, on the transparency and disclosure issue, the concern we have is that transparency for some, when it's taken in a crude way, and as an end in itself, you start thinking about what's the quality of evidence around which people are being transparent. And in the US and in many contexts, that is driven by audit reports. And some from third parties who do effective and useful due diligence, but mostly these are audit reports, and the minute you have something certified, you have to question the credibility of that, and you have to question the assumptions around which data is collected. What we do absolutely know from our experience is that the most vulnerable workers are never going to get captured in an audit. They are far too desperate and far too vulnerable to raise their heads, and they are way down the supply chain, 7, 8, 9 tiers deep, very often, those that are really in a forced labour situation. Some are closer to the surface, but the most vulnerable workers are never ever going to show up in an audit, and actually sort of information from trusted migrant worker organizations, NGOs, service providers, don't often have the ear of employers either. So you've got this weird situation where trade unions are quite often not present, either because they're not allowed, into certain workplaces, or because they simply don't have the reach to negotiate and raise grievances with employers and deal with those issues in due process. You've got a whole army of auditors out there trying to conduct or reassuring companies that they are undertaking their due diligence on behalf of them, not looking in the right places, not examining the records that are never shown, not getting beneath the surface. And so, the quality of information that is disclosed in these transparency statements, in modern slavery statements, I think is a question. And we look, therefore, at issues like the level of commitment by the board, by the senior leadership, by investors, what kinds of policies, strategies and resources and expertise are driving change, at what point are they making decisions and stopping purchasing decisions at a certain point where they're not reassured by what their suppliers are doing or saying. And most importantly, that actually workers have a voice themselves through representative organizations. And when they work best, they are independent, representative trade unions who act on behalf of workers collectively, not individual workers, not surveyed through a mobile phone survey, but actually collectively represented to raise their grievances. And unfortunately, we've got a long way to go before those structures and systems and negotiating space exists. But there's no question in our minds that is the most effective way to address this. And so in the reporting, we look for issues like, what is their approach to freedom of association, collective bargaining? What is the quality of their decision makers, and what's the understanding of their decision makers, and at what point does price, speed, and all those costs, how are they factored in, and how transparent are they about what they factor in when they place an order? So that for us is in a way a lot more important than some of the sort of audit information that is often presented.
So, the Modern Slavery Act, it's been a little more than 6 months since it was passed. And what is your sense of how corporations are gearing up for these reporting requirements? I mean, and is there a role that ETI can play in, using its leverage to actually widen the circles of corporations that would go beyond merely reporting, as you just said, simply as an obligation?
Yes.
To the government?
Yes. Well, so what we're currently doing is we're having discussions and developing some training and guidance for our members, and trying to engage with other stakeholders. But my own area of work, which is a new area for our strategy, what we have an ambition to see is that a percentage of our members are demonstrating modeling good practice. I'm not over optimistic about how many that's going to be, but my hope is that at least 20% of our members in the next few years, and I think the first year of reporting is going to be at a fairly basic level, it's the subsequent years that we're going to see change, that they are going to be able to show what good looks like, because some of them have been thinking about responsible business and ethical trade, labour issues before most others. I mean, some companies are just coming to the table now. and that, ideally what good looks like, we will be able to point to some examples. I have to say that I haven't seen a lot of that so far. Mm-hmm. I've seen some projects, and those projects, I think, are useful, but they're just a starting point. Initiatives like Stronger Together and Project Isara and so on, they're good and useful, but they're not it. That actually what we want to see is the internal business operations being challenged and worked through in a fundamental way, and that not only individual businesses but in partnership with others, because they have to work together to get the leverage they need in a particular supply chain in a particular country. So so I think I'd like to be able to point to good, and I haven't seen good yet. Mm-hmm. So when I do, I'll let you know whether we've succeeded.
So I guess there seems to be such a huge gap between, what would be ideal, which you say doesn't exist yet, and actually how many corporations there are that would sign up to it, given the complexity of, transnational corporations, aiming for fundamental change seems to be very, very difficult, and I would say even optimistic. So if you were to think about, the strategic goals of ETI in the short term and the long term, what would those be? How can one actually achieve this kind of change when supply chains are, going, 40, 50 layers deep into different parts of the world, and there's a combination of the formal economy and the informal economy involved in this. How do we begin to move in that direction? So what is ETI's sort of short-term strategy and long-term strategy? Is there a role for consumers, for instance, in trying to shift, produce the shift effectively?
Yes, so I think for us the short-term strategy involves helping companies understand what due diligence looks like, and we're developing a kind of framework for how we see due diligence from a multi-stakeholder perspective. It's obviously based on the principles of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, but trying to look at due diligence from a slightly different perspective, and to get our members to kind of recognize and take that on. They will help to shape it as well. And to think about adequate processes of remediation, which involve a serious attempt at remediation. So in the short term, I think that's our plan. In terms of, other things that you spoke about, and I'm just trying to capture this. I think we are starting to engage with the investment community because they're interested, they're engaged in the issue. It was only this morning we had an ethical insights session with the on responsible investment. Does it drive change? Can it drive change, and how? And I think there is a genuine debate to be had about how investors could drive a different kind of conversation with companies and challenge them a lot more on what they're doing. As far as consumers go, there is certainly a role for consumers in asking the right questions, I think price is a sensitive issue, and it's almost like a no-go zone for many companies because of competition law. But we need to have a hard conversation about how it is you can buy a t-shirt for £2 and imagine that there's no exploitation underneath that. Now, we're not saying price is everything, because you can get efficiencies in a business and you can streamline your industry model and you can do it in responsible ways, but we have to stop this downward pressure on prices for products and consumers' expectations that not only do they expect companies not to have slavery in their supply chain, but by the way, they also expect to get a good bargain. And I'm not of the view that we should make it the fault of consumers, because a lot of companies will say, well, we are determined by our consumers, and I don't buy that. But equally, for one company to act and stand outside of the norm takes huge courage and leverage. So we're seeing the change in Unilever, and they're one of the leaders, I would say, at least in demonstrating a seriousness to address these things and engaging with the trade unions and engaging with the NGOs and being willing to be challenged. But they have serious leverage and influence because of the size of their market. And for those others, they need to work with one another to do that, to get that degree of leverage. And so I think it's a long haul, but I think having a more sophisticated, more nuanced conversation about this, and not simply naming, blaming, shaming companies, although that definitely has its place. I think that drives a sort of very crude reaction. It means companies pull out, workers suffer, lose their jobs. Somebody else will buy those products, somebody who's asking fewer questions. And the boycott, name, shame thing has its place, but only so far. And I think workers' representative organizations, trade unions, would never argue that was the ideal choice, is to pull out. And investors are also showing that when they place very serious sort of conditions and say we're going to walk unless these things change, those companies might lose those investors, but they're finding others, and so you've lost your leverage. And we're not saying stay in no matter what. We definitely don't agree with that, but we have to do what we can to stay in the game and see improvements.
So coming back to the law, then it seems like that the law is a game changer, right? I mean, in many ways, it can. It is traditionally, it's been the role of the state to actually push for these kinds of conversations, and clearly in the case of the Modern Slavery Act, it the state was missing till the initiative came from corporations. So if one were to now go back to the state, I mean, what would you like to see in the law that would produce this kind of fundamental change, at the same time be sensitive to some of the unintended consequences which you've just pointed out, so that we can stay in the game but push things a little further?
Yeah. I mean, I would like to see a really comprehensive labour inspection system. I think the law and the government need to create a red line that is absolutely clear for all actors, over which nobody should be allowed to step. And they need to know that they are being scrutinised and that they are being monitored. And I think the culture of deregulated industry and labour market deregulation creates an environment for labour exploitation. There is no doubt. Companies that can get away with it will get away with it. And, it's a slippery slope. it's not all at the end of the forced labour, but these indicators add up. 0 hours contracts, very long hours, very limited wages, and so on, are clear drivers. But it's not just in the UK, but there is a long way to go in Europe and in the US, and then there is a very long way, obviously, for that conversation to take root in some of the other countries. And so we look to industry and our stakeholders from time to time to place pressure on governments and local actors, local industry, from where they source products as well, to drive a different kind of conversation. The government has to play its part in protecting workers as much as companies have to play their part in respect. So I do think that it's very hard for one to happen without the other. And I think government would like to sort of pass the buck to corporates, and corporates would like to kind of say, well, it's not our fault. In fact, it's not even our supply chain. In fact, we don't even employ these workers. And when you get conglomerates and you get, different models of ownership and responsibility and use of agents and so on, the legal framework and the prosecution and so on becomes that much more tenuous. So I think the law plays a really important role in terms of criminal prosecution and civil cases, but we shouldn't overestimate or underestimate the extent to which those can stick. So I really do believe it's got to happen from all sides, and I don't think there is one answer.
That's great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.